Louisiana, Beaufort Parish, 1848. Midnight is not an hour on a plantation. It is a jurisdiction. In daylight, the law is a whip, a ledger, a name on a deed. At midnight, the same men who preach order begin negotiating with fear. That's where the story starts. Not with a ghost, not with folklore, but with a door that opens itself on purpose. They said he was a shadow. They said he crossed yards without footprints, slipped past dogs without a bark, appeared at the foot of beds like a punishment sent by God. They called him the Midnight Phantom because they needed a myth that sounded cleaner than the truth. His real name, the one spoken only in low voices, was Elias Crowe. Enslaved. Black. A man whose steps were counted in daylight, yet somehow uncounted at night. Understand the accusation. If a plantation owner opens his house to an enslaved man after midnight, it is not mercy. It is dependency. And dependency always hides a crime. The first documented pattern in Beaufort Parish in early 1847 is simple. Elias is seen on the river road after dark with a satchel. Not a sack of cotton. Not tools. A satchel kept close to the chest, the kind of bag white men claim only they deserve to carry. He reaches the Rathbone Plantation, one of the loudest houses in church, one of the harshest fields at harvest, and the gate is not barred. The dogs are not loosed. The night watch looks away. That is not an accident. That is coordination. And when Elias steps up to the main house, there is no shout of thief, no pistol cocking, no righteous outrage. The latch is already lifted. A lamp is already burning low. A door opens like a confession. They'll tell you it was superstition. They'll tell you the owners feared a curse. That is the lie men tell when they want to hide a transaction. In 1847, the Mississippi River corridor is full of disease, debt, and scandal, things that move faster than wagons and louder than sermons. Yellow fever isn't polite. Malaria doesn't respect property lines. A cough in one house becomes a funeral in another. And behind those illnesses are the quieter sicknesses. Morphine and laudanum, secret pregnancies, unpaid notes, men who don't want their weakness seen in daylight. Every plantation claims to be a fortress. But at midnight, the fortress needs supplies, and it needs them without witnesses. Elias becomes the corridor's dark artery. Not because he is allowed, because he is required. That's why the rumor starts. The overseer Caleb Mott, Rathbone's hired violence, spreads it first, because it benefits him. Don't stop him, Mott says. You can't stop him. He doesn't say why. He doesn't say the satchel is medicine. He doesn't say the messages inside are sealed. He doesn't say the delivery is for the master's household, not the quarters. He doesn't say that if Elias is delayed, the wrong person might die, the wrong secret might be exposed, the wrong debt might be called in. A myth is cheaper than an explanation, and it keeps everyone obedient. The enslaved fear the phantom. The owners fear the consequences. The overseers profit by controlling both. This is where the record needs to be read honestly. Elias is not walking because he is free. He is walking because they made him walk. Midnight travel isn't privilege. It's assignment. It's risk without protection. He moves through cypress dark roads, past ditches that can swallow a body, past men who would shoot first and ask later, except on the nights they are expecting him. He doesn't knock like a guest. He arrives like a necessity. And necessity has its own kind of authority in a society built on theft. The owners will call him property with their mouths while treating him like infrastructure with their actions. That contradiction is the point. That contradiction is the evidence. By late spring of 1847, the parish is already whispering the same phrase. Every house opened for him at midnight. That sentence is not awe. It's an indictment. It means the owners collectively agreed, without saying it aloud, that Elias was too dangerous to stop. Not because he had a weapon, because he had access. Because he carried things they could not afford to lose and truths they could not afford to reveal. The ghost story is a cover story for an illegal economy of discretion. The moving of tinctures, the moving of letters, the moving of favors between households that pretend they don't need each other. Look at who is awake when he arrives. It isn't the field hands. It isn't the children. It is the inner circle. The mistress who can't sleep because the master is sweating through sheets, the doctor's note folded in half, the servant ordered to stand aside and forget what he saw. On Rathbone, Margaret Rathbone is recorded in household talk as the woman who kept a lamp for the shadow. The phrase survives because it was repeated like a prayer. But prayer isn't what it was. It was preparation. She doesn't fear him as a ghost. She fears what happens if the satchel doesn't arrive. By summer 1847, the myth spreads beyond Rathbone. Elias is seen at the Kershaw estate boundary. Though Edmund Kershaw won't arrive until years later, his family name already carries money and arrogance. He passes through the backyard of the Duvernay place, old French holdings, rigid manners, rot beneath the lace. Each time, the same pattern. The latch is not locked. The dog is quiet. The guard is suddenly stupid. If this were truly a haunting, there would be panic. Instead, there is routine. That routine is the clearest proof that the phantom story is staged. The owners don't fear the supernatural. They fear exposure. They fear interruption. They fear being forced to explain, in daylight, what they are doing in darkness. And Elias knows it. Not because he is a mastermind, because he is the one standing in the doorway, hearing the words they never say at the dinner table. He sees the trembling hands, hears the hurried whispers, watches money change hands in ways that don't appear in ledgers. He learns which house has sickness, which house has a debt coming due, which house has a son who is a liability. The owners believe they are using him like a courier. But every delivery is also a receipt. Every midnight entrance is evidence that their authority is not absolute. It is conditional. They can command his body, but they cannot command what he knows. So understand what is being revealed here. The plantation system is not only violence, it is dependence on the people it brutalizes. That dependence is never admitted. It is disguised as folklore, disguised as religion, disguised as order. The truth is simpler and uglier. They opened the doors because Elias carried medicine and messages through a region that pretended it was self-sufficient. They opened the doors because he held together a private network of emergencies and secrets. They opened the doors because stopping him would mean asking questions they could not survive. This is not a romantic tale about a clever enslaved man outwitting masters. Do not turn it into that. Elias is walking a corridor built by other people's guilt. He is allowed through because their households are fragile, because their bodies fail, because their sins require silence. If you want a moral to hold in your hand, hold this. When a slave society calls a man a ghost, it is often because they cannot admit he is human, and that his humanity includes memory. The men who owned plantations in Beaufort Parish in 1847 wanted to own everything except the record of their own dependence. They wanted the benefit of Elias's movement without the truth of why they needed it. And so they wrote a myth. If you're listening from somewhere in the world, comment where you're from. And subscribe, because this file does not close at midnight. It opens. The deeper you read it, the clearer it becomes. The phantom was never the mystery. The mystery was why the powerful were willing to kneel to an enslaved man's footsteps in the dark, then pretend, in the morning, that it never happened. By 1848, Beaufort Parish stops pretending this is superstition and starts behaving like an organization. A ghost story doesn't require schedules. A ghost story doesn't require payments. A ghost story doesn't require a doctor's handwriting folded into a pocket. But Elias Crowe's route does. And that is the first hard truth. The Midnight Phantom was not a haunting. He was a courier system, built by plantation owners who publicly worshipped law and privately feared delay. In January 1848, after a wet winter and a sickly spring forecast, the parish sees its first quiet change. Lanterns are hung in back corridors, not front halls. Stables are left unlatched, not gates. The owners don't want the neighbors to see who they are expecting. They want Elias to enter like a stain that doesn't spread. They want him invisible. Not because he is dangerous, because the contents of his satchel are. This is where names matter. Doctor. Silas Harrow begins appearing in the background of these nights, never in public speeches, never in sermons, always in the margins. In March 1848, Harrow is already known along the river corridor as a physician willing to travel to plantations without asking what caused the injuries. That silence is not neutrality. It is participation. Harrow's remedies are not miracles. They are commodities. Quinine for fever, laudanum to quiet pain, tinctures and poultices to keep bodies working, bandages to hide evidence, and, most important, notes that establish a private chain of responsibility. The note says, in effect, do this, take this, don't speak. And who carries those instructions? Not the master's son, not the overseer, not a white messenger who might gossip in town. They send Elias. They send the enslaved man because, in their own warped logic, he is both disposable and reliable, two qualities no human being should ever be forced to embody at the same time. The route becomes standardized by mid-1848. Elias does not wander. He runs a circuit. Rathbone first, then Duvernay, then the smaller holdings that cling to the larger ones like parasites, places that cannot afford a doctor publicly but can afford one privately. By June 1848, the parish has learned the most perverse lesson of all. The enslaved man can move across property lines faster than any official correspondence. He can cross boundaries because, in daylight, he is considered beneath attention. That social blindness becomes their nighttime advantage. And the people who claim to own him exploit that blindness like a tool. Let's be precise about the mechanism of control. Elias is not trusted. He is managed. He is told when to leave, which roads to avoid, which yards will be open, which dogs will be fed. Someone in each household is assigned to watch for him, not to protect him, but to ensure the delivery arrives and the secret stays contained. In Beaufort Parish, secrets do not float freely. They are handled like contraband. And by late 1848, Elias is carrying contraband that is not only medical. He is carrying messages, thin paper, sealed wax, a name on the outside that looks respectable in daylight and poisonous at midnight. This is what the plantation owners never admit. They needed an enslaved network because their own society was built on suspicion. They did not trust each other, not fully. They competed for land, for sugar yields, for influence at church. They ruined each other with rumors. And yet, when they were sick, when their debts pressed, when their private lives threatened to become public, They needed a discreet channel. The official mail system is too visible. A white messenger is too talkative. A doctor's visit is too noticeable. Elias, moving after midnight, solves their problem. That is why no one stops him. The phantom is not an intruder. He is a service. The accusations deepen in 1849. This is the year the myth solidifies into policy. It becomes common talk among overseers. If you see Crowe, you let him pass. Not because they fear magic, but because they fear punishment from above. Interfering with Elias's run risks disrupting deliveries that the master himself depends on. In February 1849, a fever runs through the corridor. The public story is prayer. The private reality is triage. Quinine moves first toward the main houses. Laudanum follows. Bandages and alcohol follow. Enslaved quarters, meanwhile, are told to endure. And here the moral line is sharp enough to cut. The system that claims black bodies are property treats them as replaceable when sick, yet panics when the owner's child coughs. Elias is forced to carry the tools of that hypocrisy from door to door. He is a witness with no legal standing, a human being used as an unacknowledged lifeline. And there is another layer they don't want recorded. The satchel also carries remedies for shame. There are ailments no owner wants documented in town. There are injuries that should be investigated, not treated quietly. There are women who should be protected, not silenced with medicine. There are infants whose existence would scandalize church pews. The midnight route becomes a mechanism not only for health but for concealment. That's why they dress it up in superstition. Ghost is a moral disguise. It turns their dependence into a mystery, and mysteries don't require accountability. Margaret Rathbone plays her part in this system with the calm of someone protecting a reputation. In late summer 1849, she is known to keep certain supplies ready: clean cloth, boiled water, an extra lamp, not because she is generous, but because she expects the visits. She knows Elias will come, and she knows what it means if he doesn't. She is the kind of person who can speak of order while relying on disorder to maintain it. The order of the plantation is never as clean as the propaganda claims. It is patched, night after night, with quiet deliveries and forced silence. What does Elias gain? Do not romanticize it. He gains movement. Yes, but movement is not freedom when it is assigned. He gains knowledge, but knowledge is not safety when everyone around you benefits from your silence and fears your memory. By the end of 1849, Elias has something more dangerous than a knife. He has a map of weaknesses. Which owner is sick? Which family is drowning in debt? Which overseer takes bribes? Which household is terrified of scandal? It is a map created by their own dependents, not by his ambition. He is made into a courier, and in the process, he becomes an archive. And that is why the parish begins speaking about him in religious language. Not because they believe he is a spirit, but because they sense, without admitting it, that he carries judgment. A man who passes through your home at midnight and sees what you hide is a threat to the story you tell about yourself. Plantation owners do not fear the supernatural. They fear exposure. They fear that their authority is performative, loud in daylight, fragile in darkness. They fear that an enslaved man has walked through their private corridors often enough to know the truth about them. So here is the investigative conclusion of 1848 to 1849. Elias Crowe becomes indispensable not because he is respected, but because the system is addicted to secrecy. This region calls him a phantom to avoid acknowledging that they built a hidden network on the back of a captive human being. They made him walk the night so they could keep their days clean. And if you want the moral accounting to be honest, you must say it plainly. Every unlatched door was a confession. Every quiet delivery was proof that the men who claimed absolute control were, in fact, dependent on the labor, endurance, and enforced discretion of the person they refused to recognize as fully human. Remember that. Write it down in your mind like a ledger. Because the system survives when people forget how much it relied on the very people it tried to erase. By 1850, the midnight route is no longer just medicine. It is leverage. And leverage is what plantation owners fear most when it sits in the hands of someone they have legally declared to be less than human. Louisiana's Beaufort Parish and the river corridor don't say it out loud, but their behavior confesses it. They are no longer simply receiving Elias Crowe. They are managing his knowledge, trying to keep it boxed, trying to keep it silent, trying to keep it useful without letting it become dangerous. That is the fatal misunderstanding of every slave society. You can chain a body, but you cannot chain what the body sees. And Elias has seen too much. In January 1850, the pattern shifts. The households begin issuing instructions not just about delivery times, but about what Elias must not witness. They move the exchange point from bright hallways to side rooms. They lower voices. They hide papers under plates and inside hymn books, the same hymn books they pretend are holy. They ask him to wait outside the master's study, then panic when he is close enough to hear. That panic is not superstition. It is guilt reacting to proximity. It is the instinct of criminals when the wrong person stands near the evidence. What secrets move through a plantation corridor at midnight? Start with the obvious, the ones they pretend are private family matters. Illness, debts, shame. But the 1850 route carries something more volatile. Communications that can ruin reputations and trigger violence between whites. In March 1850, sealed notes begin traveling between Rathbone and Duvernay that are not medical instructions. They are warnings about creditors, about lawsuits brewing in town, about landlines disputed, about men in Baton Rouge who ask questions. These owners live in a world where public image is currency. A rumor can collapse a plantation's credit. A whispered scandal can change who sits on a parish board. They are terrified of paper in daylight because paper can be copied. So they move it at night, through an enslaved man, and tell themselves it doesn't count as official. Then there are the secrets that are not merely embarrassing, but criminal. In July 1850, an overseer's beating goes too far on a smaller holding near the river. The victim does not die on record. The record never wants deaths that look like murder. But the household needs the body to stay quiet, and it needs the workforce to keep moving. So a request goes out through Elias for something to settle the pain, something to stop the fever, something that keeps him alive long enough to keep him silent. If you hear this and feel disgust, hold on to it. That disgust is your moral instrument. It is what the system relied on eroding. Because this is how violence becomes routine. It is not only committed, it is medically maintained. Doctor. Silas Harrow remains central in 1850, but his role becomes sharper. He is no longer just a doctor, he is a service provider for secrecy. His prescriptions are tools. Quinine and laudanum, yes, but also discretion. In September 1850, Harrow's note is delivered to Rathbone folded twice, with a line that effectively orders compliance without public record. Elias becomes the carrier of these lines, an unwilling link between respectable signatures and indecent realities. And in a society like this, a link is a liability. Because a link proves connection. It proves coordination. It proves that the brutality was never random. It was administered. By late 1850, Elias is not only delivering secrets, he is collecting them simply by being present. Not by eavesdropping like a thief, by standing where they force him to stand. A mistress who thinks enslaved people are furniture will say a thing in front of him she would never write down. A master sweating through a fever will confess with his guard down. A son drunk on entitlement will brag. Elias hears the names of women who are problems, the names of men who are owed, the dates of meetings they claim never happened. And the corridor learns, slowly, that Elias is an archive with legs. This is where the ghost myth becomes protective camouflage. The owners begin to use it like a legal trick. If Elias is stopped, they say he slipped through anyway. If Elias is seen, they say he appeared. If Elias is questioned, they say no one can explain him. It is a deliberate attempt to make him unaccountable and therefore unusable as a witness. A ghost cannot testify. A ghost cannot keep receipts. A ghost cannot name names. They try to strip him of reality so that his memory cannot threaten their reality. That is the moral rot at the heart of it. They do not merely enslave his labor, they attempt to enslave the meaning of his existence. But meaning leaks. In October 1850, the quarters begin repeating a different version of the story. Not the white version about a phantom, but the black version about a man who walks because he must, and who hears because they cannot stop talking. Enslaved people understand what owners refuse to admit. Information is power, and power is never stable. Elias becomes a quiet reference point, someone who knows which plantation is hungry, which overseer is crueler than usual, which household is sick, which road is watched. The midnight route, created to protect white households, begins producing unintended consequences. It becomes a shadow channel through which enslaved communities infer danger and opportunity. The owners sense this, and their response is not reform. It is containment. In November 1850, Caleb Mott, still Rathbone's enforcement, tightens daytime restrictions on Elias. He limits where Elias can stand, who Elias can speak to, how long Elias can remain near the quarters after a night run. That contradiction is telling. They rely on him at midnight, then punish him at noon for being too present. The system wants his movement without his voice. It wants his competence without his dignity. It wants him to function like a tool, and it panics when the tool exhibits human memory. So the corridor develops an unspoken rule. Elias must not be harmed. Not because they value his life, but because harming him threatens them. If Elias disappears, questions arise. If Elias is found dead, the route is exposed. If Elias is punished publicly, the doctor's notes and sealed letters suddenly have a human story attached, one that could spill. By the end of 1850, Elias is trapped inside a sick arrangement. He is protected for the same reason a thief protects a key. The key is not honored. It is guarded because it opens doors. And those doors keep opening. Rathbone, Duvernay, the smaller holdings, houses that would shoot any other black man on sight after dark. They open because the owners are not brave. They are dependent. They open because they have built private necessities they cannot justify publicly. They open because Elias can walk into their rooms and see what daylight never sees. The trembling of men who claim power. The desperation of women trying to keep a family name intact. The hypocrisy of a system that demands obedience while begging for services it refuses to acknowledge. The investigative claim is now unavoidable. By 1850, Elias Crowe is not a rumor. He is an index of regional sin. Every trip adds entries, names, dates, ailments, payments, threats. He does not need to write them down to possess them. The human mind, when forced to survive, becomes a ledger. And slave societies are uniquely terrified of ledgers they cannot control. So remember the real horror here. Not that a man could enter houses at midnight. The horror is that he was allowed, because the men inside those houses needed him more than they needed their own ideology. They needed the enslaved man to stabilize their fragile bodies and fragile reputations, and they were willing to suspend their own rules to get it. That is what their open doors prove. And if we do not name this clearly, we become accomplices after the fact, letting the myth of a phantom replace the truth of a coerced courier who held a region's secrets simply by being forced to carry them. 1851 is the year the corridor stops feeling like a rumor and starts looking like a system of moral triage: who gets to live comfortably, who gets to suffer quietly, and who is forced to carry the supplies that enforce that hierarchy. If you want the plantation's true theology, don't listen to Sunday sermons. Watch what happens when sickness arrives. Watch which doors open at midnight, and which bodies are left untreated in the dark. In Beaufort Parish, the owners speak of providence while ordering quinine like it's ammunition. They preach discipline while purchasing oblivion by the bottle. And Elias Crowe, the enslaved courier they call a phantom, becomes the unwilling bridge between their public virtue and their private panic. In January 1851, Dr. Silas Harrow's notes become more frequent and more carefully hidden. The paper is folded smaller. The handwriting is tighter. The instructions are less like advice and more like control. Dosages, timing, silence. Harrow is not merely treating illness, he is managing appearances. Because the corridor's first priority is not health. It is reputation. A plantation can survive a fever. It cannot survive scandal that disrupts credit, inheritance, or the myth of mastery. So the medicine route expands, and with it, the hypocrisy hardens. Owners who deny enslaved people blankets in winter suddenly demand urgent deliveries for a cough in the big house. They punish idleness with lashes in daylight, then demand a stimulant at midnight to keep their own workers moving. They are not confused about what they are doing. They are deliberate. This is where the record becomes prosecutorial. Elias's satchel is not a neutral object. It is an instrument of unequal survival. When it contains quinine, who receives it first? When it contains laudanum, whose pain is considered worth quieting? In early 1851, the corridor's pattern is consistent. The main house gets relief. The quarters get endurance. That is not a failure of medicine. It is a decision. And it reveals the plantation's true rule. The enslaved are valuable as labor, not as lives. The owners will spend money to preserve output, not dignity. They will preserve a master's sleep before they preserve a captive's health. By late spring 1851, the moral contradiction becomes visible even to those who benefit from it. Caleb Mott, Rathbone's overseer, increases punishment in the fields to compensate for lost productivity from illness. This is not discipline, it is extraction under stress. When bodies weaken, he does not ease the burden, he escalates it. And at the same time, the big house increases its orders through Elias. The corridor effectively does this. It tries to medically stabilize white households while physically punishing black labor into continued function. That is the plantation in its purest form: treatment for the owners, trauma for the owned. Then comes August 1851. The month matters because heat turns sickness into speed. Fever rises faster. Dehydration kills faster. Panic becomes policy. In Beaufort Parish that summer, an outbreak, called different names by different mouths, because naming it too precisely invites questions, moves through the corridor. You don't need a public proclamation to know it happened. You can track the behavior. Lamps lit later, deliveries doubled, prayers louder, tempers sharper. Elias is sent out more often. He is sent out in worse conditions. He is sent out because the owners need a single discreet line connecting their houses, their doctor, their secrets. They do not want wagons. They do not want witnesses. They want the phantom to do what a human being is forced to do. Carry their survival in a satchel while risking his own. On the Rathbone Plantation in mid-August 1851, Margaret Rathbone's household is rumored to be sick, enough that servants are ordered to boil water continuously, enough that the master's voice is reportedly absent from morning routines. That absence is a crack in the facade. When the master is weak, the entire system becomes anxious, because it is built on his performance of strength. In those nights, Elias is admitted more quickly than ever. No delays. No questions. If the myth were true, that they feared him as a ghost, they would barricade and pray. Instead, they facilitate. They need the satchel. They need what it contains. They need to keep the illness inside the house from becoming a story outside the house. And here is the indictment that should not be softened. While the big house receives urgent medicine, the quarters receive stricter control. In August 1851, field workers who collapse are accused of faking. Men with shaking hands are threatened. Women with fever are told to return to work as soon as they can stand. If a sick enslaved person dies, the plantation treats it like an inventory loss. If a sick owner suffers, the corridor mobilizes. That difference is not of its time. It is the core crime of the system. It assigns different moral value to different bodies and pretends that value is ordained. Elias moves through this landscape like a living contradiction. By day, he is property, watched, ordered, restricted. By night, he becomes essential, trusted with access, permitted across boundaries, treated as a necessary evil. And the evil is not his. The evil is the arrangement that forces a captive man to deliver painkillers to the hands that hold the whip. Because make no mistake, the medicine does not replace violence. It supports it. Laudanum quiets not only illness, but consequences. Tinctures soothe not only fever, but guilt. Bandages cover not only wounds from accidents, but wounds from punishment. The corridor uses medicine to keep the machine running, and the machine is built from coercion. In September 1851, after the worst of the outbreak passes, the corridor does not thank Elias. It does not reduce his burden. It does not loosen chains. It does what slave societies always do after a crisis. It rewrites the story so the powerful look noble. Plantation owners frame survival as God's mercy. They do not mention the midnight deliveries. They do not mention the enslaved courier who kept the doctor's instructions moving. They do not mention the differential distribution of care. The narrative is sanitized. The evidence is hidden. And if nobody records the truth, the lie becomes history. By early 1852, the corridor has learned a practical lesson from 1851. Secrecy works. Private routes protect reputations. Coerced couriers reduce visibility. So they formalize the pattern without ever writing it down. A house that never dared to admit dependence now admits it nightly. A man who should not be allowed through the front door is ushered through the side. Not because the owners became less racist, because they became more desperate. And desperation always reveals what ideology tries to conceal. The plantation economy is not self-sufficient. It is not disciplined. It is brittle, sickly, and constantly patched by the labor and knowledge of people it claims are inferior. Caleb Mott's role in 1852 becomes more openly predatory. He recognizes what the owners refuse to acknowledge. Elias's movement gives him knowledge, and knowledge creates risk. Mott responds in the simplest language of the plantation: threats. He increases daytime surveillance. He restricts Elias's contact with other enslaved people. He tries to isolate him, as if isolating a witness can erase what the witness has already seen. But isolation does not remove memory. It only sharpens it. And that is what the owners never calculate properly. The more they use Elias at midnight, the more they teach him their patterns, their weaknesses, their hypocrisies. They are building a record inside a man they refuse to recognize as a person. This is the moral line you cannot step around. The Corridor's midnight medicine is not a story about kindness. It is a story about self-preservation, dressed in religious clothing. They kept doors open for Elias because they needed him to keep their world from collapsing. And then, in daylight, they continued collapsing other people's worlds with whips, hunger, and law. If you want to understand the plantation system, stop chasing the phantom myth. Follow the medicine. Follow who receives it, who is denied it, and who is forced to carry it. Because the truth is not mystical. It is administrative. The plantation owners of Beaufort Parish in 1851 to 1852 built a hidden supply chain to protect themselves, and they chained a man to it, then dared to call him a ghost so nobody would ask why the doors were open in the first place. Remember that. The record depends on whether we refuse the myth and insist on the mechanism. 1853 is when the Corridor makes its first serious mistake. It confuses dependence with control. For 6 years, Beaufort Parish has practiced the same quiet ritual: open doors, lowered lamps, silenced dogs, a satchel passing through side corridors like contraband. For 6 years, plantation owners have enjoyed the benefits of Elias Crowe's midnight route while pretending it was superstition, not strategy. They told themselves the phantom myth kept things safe. It did the opposite. It made them arrogant. It made them believe the system could run without consequences. Then a new man arrived with new money and an old hunger for dominance, and he tried to stop the one thing the parish had learned to protect. His name was Edmund Kershaw, and the year matters because it marks the moment the Corridor's hypocrisy became a test, one it could not pass without exposing itself. Kershaw enters the parish in March 1853, purchasing a struggling holding along the River Road, a place that had already been quietly integrated into the midnight network. He arrives with the posture of reform. Locks, schedules, patrols. In daylight, he speaks the language of order, the same language slave societies always use when they are about to commit something ugly and call it discipline. He does not believe in ghosts. He believes in ownership. He hears the rumor that an enslaved man can enter any house at midnight, and he takes it as a personal insult, not because he wants justice, but because he wants total control. That distinction is crucial. Men like Kershaw do not oppose cruelty. They oppose any cruelty they do not personally administer. In April 1853, Kershaw issues an instruction to his overseer, first verbal, then repeated until it becomes a threat. If Elias Crowe steps onto Kershaw land after dark, he is to be detained. Not questioned. Not delayed. Detained. Kershaw thinks he is performing authority. What he is actually doing is pulling at a thread that holds half the parish together. Because Elias's route is not a favor to one household. It is a corridor-wide dependency chain. When you interrupt it, you don't just inconvenience a courier. You disrupt a hidden economy of medicine, messages, and mutual blackmail. The corridor responds not with public resistance, but with private panic. You can measure panic by the sudden increase in secrecy. In May 1853, deliveries to Rathbone and Duvernay shift times. The satchel is rerouted. Lamps burn later. Side gates are used more often. People who normally pretend they do not coordinate begin sending indirect signals. A servant sent for eggs to a neighbor. A doctor's visit scheduled for the stables. A church handshake that lasts too long. These are not friendly gestures. They are emergency communications from men and women who have built their comfort on an invisible system and suddenly realize one arrogant newcomer might expose it. Kershaw does not understand what he has stepped into, and ignorance makes him reckless. In June 1853, he intensifies patrols. Dogs are set loose in the yard after midnight. Locks are replaced. The road is watched. On paper, it looks like strength. In practice, it creates a new problem. Now the corridor cannot guarantee safe passage for the one person it relies on to deliver private medicine and sealed notes. And when you cannot guarantee delivery, you expose the truth that the system is not divine. It is logistical. It can fail. The test comes in late July 1853. Heat brings sickness, and sickness brings confession. On a humid night that month, Elias approaches the Kershaw boundary with his satchel, the route insisting on itself, because the corridor has demands. Whether the package is quinine, laudanum, or a sealed note, the result is the same. Kershaw's men seize him, not with righteous law, but with possession. They strip the satchel from his shoulder. They bind him. They drag him toward the outbuilding Kershaw calls secure. The intention is clear. Break the myth. Demonstrate ownership. Teach the parish that this new master does not tolerate midnight exceptions. But then something happens that slave societies cannot tolerate. Consequences. The corridor doesn't collapse dramatically. It tightens. It starts calling in favors. Within hours, a message moves, not through official channels, but through the very web Kershaw thinks he controls. Doctor. Silas Harrow is contacted indirectly. Rathbone's household becomes anxious. Duvernay's people send word without sending paper. The corridor's elite do what elites always do when threatened. They protect the system that protects them. Because the truth is this: Elias being detained isn't an act of justice. It is a threat to white households. If Elias doesn't deliver, someone's fever spikes without quinine. Someone's pain becomes loud without laudanum. Someone's debt becomes public without a warning note. Someone's scandal becomes visible without a quiet instruction. The corridor has built a dependency so deep that a single interruption can ripple outward into multiple households. And the worst fear of these owners is not death. It is exposure of how much they rely on private routes, private medicine, private silence. So the pressure comes for Kershaw, and it comes from above him, not below. In early August 1853, Kershaw receives visitors, men who smile in daylight and threaten in private. They don't say, "Release Elias because it is moral." They say it will be unfortunate if the parish begins speaking about Kershaw as a man who cannot cooperate. They hint at business. They hint at church standing. They hint at credit. They hint at the kind of ruin that doesn't require violence, only whispers. This is the corridor's true weapon: reputational discipline. It is how slave society polices its own elite. And for the first time, Kershaw sees that he is not an absolute ruler. He is one node in a network that can turn on him. Elias is released not with apology, but with a forced narrative. Kershaw's overseer tells a version that preserves the myth. He slipped through. He wasn't really caught. It was a misunderstanding. The point is not accuracy. The point is containment. The corridor cannot allow the public to understand what really happened, that an enslaved man was detained because a new owner tried to assert dominance, and then released because other owners needed the courier system intact. That truth would reveal the entire mechanism. So the parish returns to superstition as a cover story, because superstition is safer than accountability. But the consequences do not disappear. They deepen. In late 1853, Elias's route becomes more restricted in the daytime, more controlled, more watched. Caleb Mott treats Elias's detention as proof that the corridor is vulnerable, and overseers respond to vulnerability the only way they know: more coercion. They tighten the leash in daylight while still demanding the service at midnight. This is the plantation's favorite contradiction. Extract more, punish more, require more, admit nothing. By early 1854, the corridor adopts a silent rule. Kershaw is to be treated carefully, not respected, managed. Elias is routed around Kershaw land when possible, and when not possible, the corridor ensures that Kershaw's men are instructed to look away. Again, not because Elias is a ghost, because Elias is a key. And keys are guarded by people who refuse to admit they need doors. Kershaw does not accept this humiliation. In March 1854, he tries again, less openly, more cunning. He orders his overseer to search Elias's satchel for contraband. The word contraband is deliberate. It turns the corridor's private supply chain into an imagined crime committed by the enslaved man, rather than the actual crime committed by the owners who rely on secrecy. This is how power rewrites responsibility. The system commits the offense, then blames the captive for carrying the evidence. The search does not go as Kershaw expects. Either the satchel is empty of paper when it passes his land, or the contents are sealed in ways that implicate men higher than him. In either case, Kershaw learns the second lesson. The corridor does not allow proof to be easily seized. It has adapted. It has become paranoid. It has become professional. And it has made Elias carry not only supplies but strategy. What does Elias do during these attempts to stop him? He endures. That's not romantic. That's the cruelty. He cannot refuse the route without punishment. He cannot claim the route as freedom, because it is assigned and surveilled. He becomes a controlled essential, protected from certain harms because his survival benefits the corridor, but subjected to other harms because his humanity is still denied. By mid-1854, he has learned something no owner wants an enslaved man to learn. Their power is not total. It is negotiated. It is maintained by fragile agreements and mutual fear. And Elias is now positioned at the center of those negotiations, not because anyone granted him dignity, but because the corridor built itself around his forced usefulness. This is the prosecutorial conclusion of 1853 to 1854. The first real attempt to stop Elias exposed the lie underneath the ghost story. The parish did not fear him as a phantom. It feared the collapse of a secret system that served the elite. When Kershaw detained him, the corridor did not celebrate law. It panicked and intervened. That intervention is the proof. The open doors were never superstition. They were dependency with teeth. And once dependency reveals itself, it becomes a kind of hostage situation, one the powerful create, then pretend they are victims of. Remember the moral accounting. The corridor used an enslaved man as a midnight instrument and then punished him for the knowledge that instrument inevitably gained. They called him a ghost to strip him of witness status. They called him contraband to justify searching the evidence. They called him property to deny he had any rights at all. Yet they opened every house to him at midnight because they could not survive without what he carried. If you want to understand how a system like this endures, look at the moment it is threatened. It doesn't reform. It rearranges its lies, tightens its control, and keeps the doors open in the dark. 1855 begins with a quiet realization spreading through Beaufort Parish like a low fever. The corridor has created a witness it cannot legally recognize. Plantation owners can debate crops and prices in daylight, but they cannot debate what Elias Crowe has become. Not a ghost. Not a trick. An archive. A moving ledger. A human record of who asked for what, who paid for what, who hid what, and who panicked when the midnight route faltered. The corridor built its secret economy on the assumption that an enslaved man's mind did not count. That assumption is the oldest lie in the system, and by 1855 it starts to rot from the inside. Because memory is not a privilege granted by law. Memory is a consequence of seeing. After the Kershaw incident of 1853 to 1854, the corridor tightened security in ways that reveal guilt rather than strength. In January 1855, households begin changing routines. Fewer servants are allowed in the side corridors at night. Fewer lamps are left visible from the road. Deliveries are shifted to narrower time windows. These are not improvements. They are symptoms. The corridor is trying to reduce the number of witnesses to Elias's visits because it senses, without admitting it, that Elias himself is a witness who cannot be reduced. And the more they hide, the more they confirm what they deny. The midnight system exists because daylight cannot tolerate the truth. This is the year the ledger becomes a theme in the parish's own behavior. It appears in the language of control. Caleb Mott starts talking about accounts even when he's discussing people. He doesn't mean money alone. He means possession. In March 1855, Mott restricts Elias's daytime movements further and instructs the quarters to treat Elias as dangerous, not because Elias has harmed anyone, but because Elias carries information. That is what the plantation fears most. Not rebellion in the field, but knowledge moving between minds. Slave societies survive by isolating and silencing. The corridor's midnight route did the opposite by accident. It created a single man who could cross boundaries, and therefore cross narratives. Now the corridor tries to undo what it built, without breaking what it needs. But you cannot undo a record by tightening a leash. Elias continues his route, and each stop adds entries, not in ink, but in detail. In May 1855, Dr. Silas Harrow's role becomes more explicitly transactional. He begins requesting payment in quieter forms, favors, introductions, recommendations that protect his standing while he continues serving the corridor's secrecy. Harrow cannot afford public association with certain cases, so he uses Elias to keep distance. The note travels without the doctor traveling. It is medicine by proxy, discretion by design. And each proxy increases the chain of culpability. Every sealed instruction in Elias's satchel is a link between a respectable signature and an indecent act that must remain unnamed. The corridor's owners think they are reducing risk by pushing everything into the dark. They are increasing risk, because the dark concentrates evidence. When everything flows through one route, the route becomes a spine. Break the spine and the body collapses. Protect the spine and you admit you need it. And the spine, Elias, now understands the system better than the men who brag about owning it. By mid-1855, he can predict which house will request laudanum before the request arrives. He can predict which plantation will send a warning note when a creditor comes to town. He can predict which mistress will keep a lamp burning when the master's breath turns shallow. He can predict, because patterns repeat. And repeating patterns are the true fingerprints of organized wrongdoing. In September 1855, the corridor hits a moral threshold it cannot erase. A sick child in a white household becomes an emergency, and the parish mobilizes around the child as if the child is the only life that matters. The medicine moves quickly. The delivery is prioritized. Servants are ordered into silence. Meanwhile, on the same week, in the quarters of a nearby holding, an enslaved woman collapses with fever and is punished for laziness. The juxtaposition is not incidental. It is the system's doctrine enacted in real time. The corridor does not value human life equally. It values white continuity. It values property lines. It values inheritance. And it treats black suffering as acceptable background noise. If you ever wonder what evil looks like in a bureaucratic society, it looks like this. Urgent care for those with names that count. Coercion for those whose names are treated like inventory. The moral weight of this is not abstract. It lands on Elias's shoulders as a literal burden. He is forced to deliver the tools that sustain that unequal world. He is also forced to hear the private conversations that expose it. By November 1855, Elias has learned not just who is weak, but who is afraid. He knows which men keep pistols close at night because they fear retaliation. He knows which overseers keep bribes in their pockets because they fear exposure. He knows which households are one scandal away from collapse. And the corridor, sensing this, begins to speak about him in new tones. Less ghost. More problem. Less awe. More suspicion. That shift is important. It signals that the owners have stopped treating the myth as entertainment and started treating the man as risk. 1856 becomes the year of containment doctrine. In February 1856, a meeting occurs, not publicly recorded, because public records are for respectable things, between 2 or 3 leading households in Beaufort Parish. The subject is not crops. It is security. The kind of security that means preventing information from moving. The corridor begins assigning watchers to watch Elias not for escape, but for contact. They do not want him speaking with other enslaved people after a night run. They do not want him lingering near kitchens where he might overhear. They do not want him near stables where men gossip. They want him to be a courier without being a listener, as if a human being can be reduced to a pair of legs and hands. That is the delusion of slave society. It demands human function while denying human cognition, then panics when cognition proves unavoidable. Caleb Mott's methods escalate in spring 1856. He uses threats that are carefully calibrated. Punishments severe enough to intimidate, but not severe enough to damage the corridor's asset. This is the sick logic of the plantation. Elias is protected only to the degree his usefulness remains intact. He is not protected as a person. He is maintained like equipment. If he limps, the route slows. If he breaks, the system is exposed. So Mott intimidates without destroying. That balance is itself a confession that Elias is essential. And the more essential he becomes, the more the corridor fears what he knows. In late 1856, Edmund Kershaw, humiliated but not quiet, attempts a different strategy. He doesn't detain Elias openly. He spreads renewed talk that Elias is dangerous, unnatural, untrustworthy. This is not belief. It is propaganda. Kershaw is trying to push the parish back toward myth because myth can justify violence. If Elias is treated as a supernatural threat, then harm against him can be framed as self-defense. This is how slave societies prepare the ground for elimination. They dehumanize, then they moralize, then they erase. The corridor flirts with this tactic and then hesitates, Because elimination comes with consequences. Too many houses have opened. Too many hands have paid. Too many notes have passed through the satchel. Killing the courier might silence one man, but it could also force daylight into rooms that cannot withstand it. By 1857, the ledger effect is unmistakable. Elias has become a central point of contradiction. He is a captive with access, a controlled man with knowledge, a moving piece of evidence in a world built on denials. The corridor reacts by tightening the religious language around the myth. Sermons intensify about order and obedience. Overseers increase punishment for gossip. Households become harsher on servants who speak too freely. These are not moral revivals. They are defensive maneuvers. When a system fears exposure, it demands silence in the name of virtue. And here is the ethical demand the record places on us. Do not let the corridor's strategy succeed retroactively. Do not repeat their myth as if it were the truth. The truth is that plantation owners in Beaufort Parish between 1855 and 1857 built a secret corridor of medicine and messages that relied on coercion and silence, and that corridor created a human archive they could not safely control. Elias Crowe did not become powerful because the system was generous. He became dangerous to them because the system was hypocritical. They needed him to function, and they needed him not to remember. That is impossible. A man who walks through your private doors at midnight remembers. A man who carries your sealed notes remembers. A man who sees your panic remembers. And if we refuse to remember on his behalf, we complete the erasure the corridor attempted. 1858 is when the corridor's relationship with Elias Crowe reaches its final, unavoidable form. Hostage logic. Not the kind written in newspapers, but the kind practiced quietly by respectable households who cannot admit what they have built. For more than a decade, Beaufort Parish has opened doors at midnight and called it superstition. For more than a decade, an enslaved black man has carried medicine and messages through a region that publicly worships order and privately runs on secrecy. By 1858, the owners understand what they created. Elias is not just a courier. He is a record. And the record has become dangerous because the corridor is getting louder, more creditors, more politics, more rumors of upheaval creeping toward the south. When a system feels the ground shifting, it does not become merciful. It becomes paranoid. Paranoia is the final stage of hypocrisy. In January 1858, the parish tightens its nightly rituals in ways that betray fear. The route becomes less flexible. Deliveries are timed more precisely. Servants are rotated so fewer people see the same pattern. Households begin using children and innocent errands as cover for communications that should not exist. They are not reducing secrecy. They are institutionalizing it. And in that institution, Elias is both essential and intolerable. Essential because the corridor still needs the satchel. Intolerable because the satchel proves the corridor exists. Edmund Kershaw's posture changes in early 1858. He stops being merely offended and becomes strategic. His earlier attempts to detain Elias failed because the corridor intervened. So Kershaw does what men like him always do when they cannot win openly. He tries to reframe the threat. He spreads renewed talk carefully, in the right ears, that Elias is not just a courier, that he is too informed, that he moves among houses like he owns them. This language is designed to trigger the oldest reflex in slave society: fear of the enslaved mind, fear that knowledge becomes action, fear that a black man's access is a prelude to rebellion. Kershaw wants the parish to believe it is defending itself, not protecting a guilty system. He wants violence to look like security. Caleb Mott helps, Because violence needs administrators. In March 1858, Mott increases daytime restrictions again and begins to isolate Elias more aggressively from the quarters. Not because Elias is planning escape, there is no evidence of that in the corridor's own behavior, but because the corridor fears the spread of information. They have learned the worst truth about themselves. Their system depends on ignorance. If enslaved communities learn how the owners coordinate, how they hide medicine, how they send messages, then the plantation myth of total control collapses. So they attempt to seal Elias off from everyone, reducing him to a moving limb that serves only the big house. This is not just cruelty. It is risk management. But risk management cannot erase history. Elias has already carried too many notes. He has already heard too many confessions. He has already watched too many exchanges of money, tinctures, and threats. By spring 1858, the corridor is no longer merely afraid that Elias knows. It is afraid he could be forced to speak. And that fear grows because the wider world is changing. Credit markets tighten. Political tension rises. Men who used to feel untouchable begin to feel watched, not by law, but by each other. When elites get nervous, they become more likely to sacrifice those beneath them to stabilize their own image. The corridor's moral calculation in 1858 becomes brutal and simple. Keep the door open and live with a witness, or close the door and eliminate the witness. But elimination is complicated. If Elias disappears too publicly, questions appear. If he is found dead, tongues loosen. If he is sold away, the route breaks and the parish loses its discreet artery. The corridor wants a disappearance that leaves no stain on the floorboards, a vanishing that can be blamed on myth, on ghostliness, on the very superstition they manufactured. They want the story to consume the man, so the man cannot consume the story. In June 1858, the corridor begins a subtle preparation. The route is quietly tested without Elias. Small deliveries are attempted through other hands. The results are predictable. Servants talk. Notes are mishandled. A bottle breaks. A message arrives late. The corridor learns what it already knew but refused to admit. Elias is not replaceable because the system is not built on trust. It is built on coercion plus routine. Elias has been coerced into reliability over years. A new courier would not have the same disciplined fear, the same learned silence, the same practiced navigation of boundaries. In other words, the corridor has trapped itself. It cannot safely keep Elias, and it cannot safely replace him. This is the essence of hostage logic. The captor becomes dependent on the captive. By August 1858, that dependence turns inward and poisonous. Households begin treating Elias with a particular kind of cold courtesy at midnight, doors still open, lamps still low, but eyes watching longer. He is handed parcels without words, like a man being kept at arm's length from his own importance. Meanwhile, daytime surveillance increases. Mott assigns men to watch Elias's posture, his route within the plantation, his pauses. It is not about discipline. It is about reading him like a threat. A system that once used myth to protect its secret corridor now uses suspicion to protect itself from the person it used. Then comes October 1858, the month that becomes the corridor's final file. Elias is last seen on the river road with the satchel. The date is repeated differently depending on who is speaking, which is how you know the truth is being managed. Some say early October. Some say late October. That discrepancy is not innocent. It gives the corridor room to pretend it doesn't know. It gives them time to align stories. But the core details hold. He is moving at night, toward a destination that expects him, carrying something the parish cannot afford to explain. And then the route breaks. No delivery arrives. No lamp is met with a shadow. No quiet exchange occurs. The doors stay closed, or stay open and empty, depending on which household wants to claim innocence. The parish's response is immediate and revealing. Not grief, not outrage, but containment. There is no public search worthy of a human life. There are no official notices that match the corridor's dependency on him. The myth returns aggressively, because myth is their easiest tool for avoiding accountability. He was never real. He was a phantom. He slipped through the world. Listen to that language for what it is. A deliberate erasure. If Elias is a ghost, then no one must answer for his disappearance. If Elias is a ghost, then no one must explain why doors opened. If Elias is a ghost, then the corridor remains respectable. But respectability is not innocence. The silence in Beaufort Parish after October 1858 is not confusion. It is self-protection. Too many households have fingerprints on the latch. Too many people have benefited from the satchel. Too many private crises were stabilized by midnight deliveries. Elias's disappearance threatens to turn private dependency into public evidence. So the parish chooses the oldest strategy. Bury the man inside a story that cannot testify. In daylight, they continue their routines. They harvest. They attend church. They speak about order. And at night, the corridor changes. Either it collapses into louder, riskier methods, or it continues in a degraded form with new couriers who are less reliable and more brutalized. Either way, the era of the phantom ends not because the myth was solved, but because the witness is gone. And this is where the moral responsibility shifts to us. The plantation owners of Beaufort Parish wanted the record to die with Elias. They wanted his memory to be treated as rumor. They wanted the corridor to be remembered as superstition rather than an organized network of secrecy and dependence. If we accept that framing, we become the last link in their chain, doing, decades later, what they could not guarantee in 1858. Silence without force. We owe the dead and the disappeared more than entertaining myths. We owe them accurate accusation. We owe them names, years, mechanisms. So here is the indictment, stated plainly. Between 1847 and October 1858, plantation owners in Beaufort Parish created a covert corridor for medicine and messages and forced an enslaved man, Elias Crowe, to operate it under threat. They protected him only insofar as he remained useful, then treated his knowledge as a liability, and when the corridor's paranoia reached its peak, he vanished in a way that conveniently served every household that had opened its doors to him. Whether Elias escaped, was sold away, was silenced, or was swallowed by the river road, the corridor's behavior proves one thing beyond myth. The doors opened because the masters were dependent, and the silence afterward was not mystery, it was complicity. Subscribe. Comment where you're listening from. And don't offer me folklore, offer me a theory. Did Elias Crowe escape the corridor he was forced to serve? Was he sold away to erase the ledger walking in his skull? Or was he silenced on that river road in October 1858 because too many respectable doors had opened for him? Put your location in the comments. Then tell me what you think happened, because if we don't speak the record out loud, the people who benefited from his disappearance win twice. Twice.